Hello and welcome to Michael's Minty Music for today. Today we review the Half-Life 2 soundtrack released in 2004 along with the game Half-Life 2. It's a pretty good soundtrack overall, a bit too ambient at times, but generally pretty good. This is the very long and sort of small track listing. 43 tracks here, and these are the tracks I added to my playlist. 16 out of 43, so about a third-ish. That's actually pretty standard for video game soundtracks. Most of the tracks here are short and not super interesting, so they don't really make it onto the playlist. Overall, though, the album's pretty good. It's nice and consistent. Every once in a while, there's a really great track that manages to push the whole album up, which is pretty good. The genre is building off of the previous Half-Life game, Half-Life 1, although with a lot more techno and a little less rock. It's kind of a techno-rock thing, but definitely more techno synth stuff here. There's a lot more spooky ambient noise instead of the more kind of horrifying adrenaline of the first game's soundtrack, which is good for getting a consistent sound, but it does mean that the album drags a little at times, particularly in the middle. It's broken up by a couple of pretty good tracks, but it does get kind of boring about halfway through. There's just too many not great tracks. The soundtrack does a great job of flowing with its game, though, and it matches the style and feel of it really well. Although it doesn't stand great on its own, within the context of Half-Life 2, the soundtrack is pretty great. Most of the sort of ambient tracks work a lot better when you're playing a game. There were obviously no singles released before the album, although some of these tracks could be heard in the previous game, parts of them, and stuff like that. They definitely built off of the previous game's music, so. My favorite song here is probably Tracking Device. It's an upbeat techno rock track that's very reminiscent of the first game, although the last one, Lambda Core and Triage at Dawn, track 17, were also strong contenders for the top spot. There's a handful of really good tracks here. I rank this album second out of all of Kelly Bailey's work on the Half-Life games, so out of 4. I personally prefer the original soundtrack. I feel like it's more consistent and has a slightly more upbeat vibe. It also doesn't drag quite as much as the second game's soundtrack. It's more focused. Both of the Half-Life 2 episodes, though, are definitely worse. They drag just as much as the second game's soundtrack and just have less tracks overall. So it really hurts on those ones in a way that it doesn't hurt quite as much here. In terms of overall video game soundtracks, I rank this one 10th out of 13, so pretty close to the bottom here. Most of the other video game soundtracks I've heard are better. I like them better, but this one's still pretty good. It doesn't really have anything wrong with it, but it also doesn't have much that's outstanding. Not a bad listen for sure, but I'd rather go for a different soundtrack. Both the Portal 1 and Half-Life 1 soundtracks are sort of the strictly better version of this one, I would say, cutting out most of the ambient, not great tracks. Additionally, this album doesn't take my top spot from 2004. That goes to Avril Lavigne's 2004 album Under My Skin, which is one of her best, and definitely better than the Half-Life 2 soundtrack, in my opinion, just for being a traditional album and also in general quality. Next up, I'm going with something different here. I'll be reviewing the sort of jazz techno artist Thundercat. His first album was called Golden Age of Apocalypse, and it released in 2011, so stay tuned for that, and as always, stay minty.